I'm Evelyn Carter. I turned 70 last spring, and I still remember the smell of my husband's cologne lingering in the hall after he passed that night. I set his old railroad watch on the mantel and just listened to the house creak and settle around me. Outside, the rain tapped on the kitchen window like it used to when we'd sit together after supper. The phone rang, but I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear another voice filling up all that emptiness. I set my teacup down on the same coaster he always used and wondered how many more evenings I'd spend listening to memories instead of living them before I tell you what happened next. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever watched a family change right in front of your eyes. My name is Evelyn, and I grew up in a small town in Indiana, raised by parents who never had much, but managed to give me everything that mattered. A roof that didn't leak a clean porch, the kind of steady meals you put together from scratch. No matter what bills came due, my father was a factory man with hands like split leather and a gentle voice. My mother worked evenings at the pharmacy, always reminding us that a neighbor's troubles were just as real as our own. We didn't have big vacations or fancy cars, but there was always kindness and space for anybody who needed it. When I met Frank Carter at the county fair in 1974, he asked me to dance, and by autumn, he'd asked me to stay. We built a quiet life on Cherry Lane. Nothing extravagant, just soft light in the kitchen and weekends tending to the yard. Frank was a railroad dispatcher all those years. Steady as the trains he watched come and go. I taught third grade for 3 decades, baked pies for church suppers, put away every extra dollar for a future we pictured together. Our son Michael came along late in life, and even when things were tight, we never let him go. Frank was gone in the blink of an eye. Heart attack in the middle of a thunderstorm, as if the world couldn't bear the silence he left behind after 43 years together. I found myself wandering the house at odd hours, folding and refolding, his old shirts setting 2 places at breakfast out of habit. I started talking to the houseplants just to fill the quiet. Michael, my only child, lived 2 towns over. He'd stop by on Sundays, never staying long, always glancing at his phone more than at me. He'd grown up kind but cautious, more comfortable around ledgers and schedules than long conversations. I never blamed him. Life gives each of us our own wounds. One Sunday, he sat at my kitchen table tapping his fingers on the wood like Frank used to do. He said, "Mom, this house is too much for you alone. Let's sell it and find a place where we can all be together." He smiled, and for a moment, I almost believed this would bring us closer. Michael's wife Leslie was always gracious on holidays and birthdays with her soft words and polite hugs. Their daughter Hope, just 15, was thrilled at the idea of me moving in. "Grandma, you can teach me how to bake those cinnamon rolls," she said, eyes bright. I clung to that hope, the way you hold on to a warm quilt in winter. I helped with the down payment, let go of the only house I'd ever called home, and moved into their place on Magnolia Drive. The first months felt almost gentle. I made myself useful, picked up Hope from school, set out fresh bread when Leslie worked late at her nail salon. Michael ran the numbers, kept everyone on track, never letting a single bill go unpaid. I tucked my old cookbooks on a shelf in the kitchen, lined up my porcelain figurines above the fireplace, tried to make the new place feel like somewhere I belonged. It didn't happen all at once. Little things started to disappear. My cookbooks boxed up and sent to the garage. The porcelain figurines replaced by art books and scented candles. Leslie stopped calling me to the table when company came. Her compliments faded to brisk reminders about clutter or noise. I found myself drifting more and more into my own room out of the way, listening to voices rise and fall in the house. I'd helped them buy. My birthday was coming soon. I caught myself hoping for a card, or even just a kind word. But the morning came and went in silence, and that's when everything changed. Leslie's voice carried down the hallway that evening, bright and crisp, as she set the table for dinner. I could smell the chicken she'd picked up from the market, the kind with roasted herbs and a lemon slice tucked under the wing. I'd spent the whole afternoon in my room, letting the hours slip past as I sorted through old photographs and tried not to listen for footsteps that never stopped at my door. The living room was filled with soft music and the hum of conversation. I could hear Hope's laughter higher than I remembered from just a year ago, and the muffled click of Michael's laptop as he wrapped up work in the next room. I waited for Leslie to call me to the table as she always had, but when I walked out, I found the dining room already filled. A group of Leslie's friends from the salon had gathered, their voices lilting and easy as they talked about new nail colors and weekend plans. Hope barely glanced up from her phone, thumbs moving fast as she messaged friends I'd never met. Michael smiled at me, but it was quick, distracted. "Mom, can you bring out that pie you made?" he asked, already turning back to the conversation about windows and budgets and who was up for golf this Saturday. I went to the kitchen, lifted the pie I'd baked that afternoon, and set it down on the counter. "Thank you, Evelyn," Leslie said, her voice warm but distant. I stood for a moment, not sure if I should join the group at the table or wait in the kitchen. No one looked up. I poured myself a cup of tea and drifted back to my room, closing the door with a quiet click behind me. I listened as the laughter and chatter rose and fell, carrying down the hall like the sound of a party in someone else's house. I traced the edge of the quilt on my bed, trying to remember when it had started to feel so cold under my hands. It wasn't just dinner. The little things started to add up. My cookbooks, once lined up neatly on the kitchen shelf, disappeared one morning. I found them stacked in a cardboard box by the garage door, labeled in thick marker "Donate." I asked Leslie about them, and she smiled over her shoulder. "We're trying to make space in the kitchen, Evelyn. Maybe you could keep a few of your favorites in your room." A week later, my collection of porcelain birds was moved from the mantel to a high shelf in the guest closet. "We're redecorating for a more modern look," Leslie explained, running her hand over a pile of fashion magazines on the coffee table. I said nothing, just nodded, and took my little treasures to the quiet of my own room. At first, Hope would come and sit at the foot of my bed, asking questions about her grandfather, or telling me about the girls at school who never let her join in their lunch table. She'd braid my hair, or I'd show her how to make lemon bars just like we used to in the old kitchen on Cherry Lane. But as the months went by, her visits grew shorter. One evening, I heard Leslie in the hallway, her voice low and sharp. "You don't want to be like Grandma, do you? Always baking, always fussing. That's so old-fashioned." The next day, Hope barely said a word to me. She left early for school, came home late, and most days, the only sign she'd been in the house at all was a half-empty glass of orange juice on the kitchen counter. Michael was always busy, calls from work emails late into the night. When I tried to talk to him about the changes, he patted my shoulder and said, "Mom, you have to get used to the new routine. Leslie likes things a certain way." His words were gentle, but his eyes slid away from mine. He spent more time at work, coming home tired, taking dinner in the office with the door half closed. It was as if the house had swallowed me up, tucking me into the corners where I wouldn't make too much noise. The house rules changed every month. I wasn't allowed to run the washing machine on Tuesday and Thursday. Those were Leslie's days. "The electric bill is out of control," she'd say, running her hand down the page of a spreadsheet. I couldn't watch TV after 9 at night because the sound carries upstairs and Hope needs her rest. I couldn't cook anything more complicated than soup or a sandwich because fried food smells linger in the curtains. When I asked if I could invite my friend Marlene from the garden club for lunch, Leslie shook her head. "The house isn't really set up for company right now, Evelyn. Maybe another time." So my world grew smaller. I woke early, made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the sun slide over the lawn. Some days, I'd walk around the neighborhood, careful not to be gone too long, just in case I was needed. In the afternoons, I'd read or knit or sort through old letters. I called my sister every Sunday, but the conversations always ended too quickly. I waited for Hope to come home, hoping she'd want to hear a story or try a new recipe. But most days, she disappeared into her room, earbuds in the door shut tight. The distance between us widened. I saw it in the way Hope looked through me, in the way Michael avoided eye contact, in the way Leslie's voice turned sharp when I asked too many questions. I tried to remind myself that families change, that maybe I just needed to be patient. But each day, it felt a little harder to find my place. My birthday arrived that spring. I'd been up early folding laundry and dusting the picture frames in my room. I thought maybe they'd forgotten until Leslie breezed past my door, her arms full of grocery bags. "We're having friends over tonight," she said, not looking at me. "Could you bake your apple pie? Everyone loves it." I nodded, grateful for something to do. I spent the whole day in the kitchen rolling out dough-chopping apples, sprinkling cinnamon. I set the pie on the counter to cool, changed into my navy dress, and waited. By the time guests arrived, the house was full of voices, laughter, and the clink of glasses. I stayed mostly in the kitchen, refilling plates and tidying up. When I stepped into the living room, Leslie glanced at my dress and frowned. "You're awfully dressed up for a simple dinner, Evelyn. Would you mind checking on the heater in the basement? Mabel's always cold." I nodded, slipping down the narrow basement stairs, feeling the cool air brush my arms. I found the old space heater in the corner, fiddled with the dial until the coils glowed orange. I was about to go back upstairs when I heard the door close above me, then the sharp click of the lock sliding into place. "Leslie." I called up, but her footsteps faded away. I stood there in the half-light, listening to the muffled sound of music overhead, my hands shaking. I knocked, then called out again, but no one answered. After a while, I sat down on the old wooden chair beside the furnace, wrapping my shawl tighter around my shoulders. The voices upstairs grew louder, then faded as the night wore on. My birthday passed with the faint scent of apple pie drifting down from the kitchen, and the realization that I had become invisible in my own family's home. That night, as I sat in the cool dark, I understood something had shifted. The warmth and welcome I'd hoped for had slipped away, leaving only the echo of locked doors and unanswered voices. And while I waited for morning, I started to wonder just how far a person could fade before they disappeared altogether. The basement was colder than I remembered. I pulled my shawl tighter and listened to the muffled sounds above me. Music, voices, the occasional burst of laughter. Every so often, I caught a word or two through the floorboards. I thought about trying the door again, but I knew the old bolt held firm. The air smelled faintly of old paint and damp wood. I looked around, spotting a stack of storage bins and the wine rack Michael had set up last summer, lined with a few dusty bottles he always meant to open for special occasions. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in. My cell phone was in my pocket, an old flip model that Michael had given me for emergencies. I turned it over in my hands, hesitating, then switched it on. There was a single bar of signal in the corner of the screen. I scrolled through the old messages, a reminder to refill a prescription. A missed call from my sister the week before, a birthday text from a number I didn't recognize. The battery blinked yellow. I set it aside and waited, listening to the house breathing above me. My mind drifted to Hope, to the way she used to curl up at my feet and ask for stories about Cherry Lane, the time she spilled flour everywhere, trying to help me make cinnamon rolls, the bracelet she'd made for me one summer, that still hung from my dresser mirror. Lately, she'd been slipping past me in the hallway, her eyes down, always in a hurry. Sometimes, I'd hear her laughing with Leslie, or see her sitting at the kitchen island, face lit by her phone, not glancing up when I passed by. I wondered if she even knew I was in the basement. I wondered if anyone would notice if I stayed here all night. After a while, The voices grew softer, the music faded, and the click of silverware on plates turned to the shuffle of chairs and footsteps. I checked the time on my phone. It was nearly 10. The cold seeped into my bones. I found an old quilt in one of the storage bins and draped it over my shoulders, letting my thoughts wander to Frank and how he always made sure there was a lantern and extra blanket in every corner of the house, just in case. Somewhere upstairs, the back door opened and closed. I pictured the house settling into quiet. I pressed my ear to the basement door, listening for any sign that someone might remember I was gone. Nothing but silence. At some point, I dozed off. I woke to the sound of the heater kicking on a faint orange glow in the corner. I reached for my phone again, flipping through the contacts, running my finger over Michael's name. I thought about calling him, but I couldn't imagine what I'd say. I waited, drifting in and out, replaying the party in my mind. The way Leslie had smiled, the way no one had looked up when I brought out the pie. I remembered Leslie's friends laughing in the kitchen, Hope slipping away upstairs, Michael checking his watch and answering work calls in the hallway. The next morning, the house was quiet. I knocked on the door, calling softly, "Leslie, Michael." My voice echoed back. I tried again, but the silence was complete. I sat on the bottom step, hugging the quilt around me, feeling smaller than I ever had before. The memories came one after another. Michael's first Christmas, Hope's first day of kindergarten, the little clay pot she'd made me in 3rd grade. I pictured the sunlight on the kitchen floor back on Cherry Lane, the way Frank would come home with his lunch pail and smile at me from the doorway. Here, the basement air felt heavier, the walls closing in. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps on the stairs. The bolt slid open and Leslie's face appeared, lips pressed into a thin line. "You must have locked the door by accident, Evelyn," she said, not meeting my eyes. "You should be more careful." We were worried. She stepped aside, letting the sunlight spill in. I climbed the stairs, legs trembling, not trusting myself to speak. Upstairs, the house looked the same. The apple pie was half eaten on the counter. The coffee pot was empty, the mugs drying on a towel. Hope sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. She didn't look up when I entered. Michael was already gone for the day. His briefcase stood by the door. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the far end of the table. The room was full of sunlight, but I felt colder than I had all night. Leslie moved around the kitchen, talking to Hope about homework and carpool schedules. She didn't mention the basement again. Days passed, but the memory of that night stuck with me. I tried to bring it up to Michael, but he just shook his head, his eyes tired. "Mom!" It was probably a mistake. "You must have pulled the door shut behind you. Leslie said she let you out as soon as she realized." He patted my hand and checked his phone, already moving on to the next thing. The weeks blurred together. Leslie kept making new rules: no TV after 9, no friends over, no home-cooked dinners that filled the house with smells. My days shrank to a handful of rooms and routines. I watched Hope drift farther away, spending more time at her friends' houses, barely speaking when she came home. The old bracelet vanished from my dresser. My wedding photo disappeared from the nightstand, replaced by a scented candle. Each day I found another piece of myself boxed up, put away, or simply gone. Sometimes I'd see my reflection in the hallway mirror and hardly recognize myself. A woman with tired eyes, clutching a shawl around her shoulders, waiting for someone to notice she was still there. The house on Magnolia Drive was full of voices, but none of them seemed to reach me. Late one evening, I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the quiet. I picked up the phone again and scrolled through the old contacts. My sister's number still listed under home. My friend Marlene from the garden club, who used to call every Sunday before I moved. Hope's cell, which I almost never dialed. I started to write a message, then put the phone down. I watched the lights across the street blink on, one by one, watched the shadows shift along the walls. The sense of being unseen grew heavier. I remembered the years when my home had been filled with laughter, when Michael and I would dance in the kitchen, when Frank's voice would carry from room to room. Now, even my memories seemed to echo back to me hollow and far away. The next morning, Leslie announced new rules for laundry and meal times. Hope was gone before sunrise, backpack slung over her shoulder. Michael called to say he'd be late. I sat by the window, watching the mail truck crawl down the street, wishing for a letter or a call, any sign that someone out there still remembered the woman I used to be. The day passed quietly. I found myself tracing the grain of the kitchen table, listening to the steady tick of the clock, feeling the emptiness fill every corner of the house. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and gray. I fixed myself a cup of tea, wrapped the shawl tighter, and settled in by the window. The silence pressed in deep and unbroken, and I wondered how long a person could go before they simply faded from view. That evening, as I sat watching the dusk settle over Magnolia Drive, I realized something had to change. The world was growing smaller by the day, and I wasn't sure how much more of myself I could give away before there was nothing left at all. The next morning, I stood in the kitchen, holding a letter addressed to me in Hope's careful handwriting. She'd left it propped against my teacup before leaving for school, a simple folded card, decorated with pressed flowers from the garden. Grandma, I'm sorry I haven't been around much. I hope you have a good day. I ran my thumb across the paper, thinking about all the mornings we'd spent together in the old house, and wondered when it had started feeling so hard to reach her. I set the note on the windowsill, the sunlight catching the petals, and fixed myself some oatmeal, listening to the hush that always settled in after Michael and Leslie left for the day. By mid-morning, the house felt too quiet. I wandered room to room, straightening pillows, refolding towels, touching the little things I'd once called mine. My hands lingered on a framed photo of Frank and me at our wedding, then slid it behind a stack of books so Leslie wouldn't move it again. I found myself counting the days since I'd spoken to my sister, thinking about her voice on the other end of the line. I reached for my phone, thumbed through the contacts, and paused over the name Diana. I hesitated, unsure what I'd even say if she picked up. I set the phone down, feeling the old ache of distance. Later, I carried a load of laundry to the basement, careful on the stairs, feeling the cool air wrap around my ankles. At the bottom, I paused and listened to the hum of the water heater, the soft creak of the house settling. I folded towels, pairing socks, my mind drifting back to years when the sound of footsteps overhead meant family, not just reminders of where I no longer belonged. I set the basket down and found myself looking around at the boxes stacked high against the far wall. Cookbooks, holiday decorations, old games from Michael's childhood. I ran my fingers over the cardboard, thinking of how much I'd packed away since moving in. When I returned upstairs, I heard Leslie on the phone in the living room. Her voice was bright, animated, full of stories about her clients and their travels, laughter trailing after her words. I stood in the hallway and watched her through the open door. "No, Evelyn's fine," she was saying. "She keeps herself busy, and we're grateful for her help, really." She caught sight of me and ended the call, smiling. "Would you mind picking up Hope after school today? I have an appointment, and Michael's working late." I nodded, smoothing my skirt. "Of course." Leslie thanked me, then disappeared into her bedroom, leaving the door closed. The drive to Hope's school was quiet, the radio playing softly. I waited by the curb, watching the students file out in small clusters, their backpacks slung low, their voices light and quick. Hope slid into the passenger seat, glancing at her phone. "Hey, Grandma," she said, not looking up. We rode home in silence. She disappeared into her room as soon as we got back, the door clicking behind her. I set the table for dinner, arranging plates and silverware, folding napkins, the way my mother used to, each fold a small act of hope that maybe tonight would be different. Dinner was quick, quiet, the conversation circling around Hope's grades, Leslie's busy day, Michael's numbers at work. I listened, answered when spoken to, then cleared the table while they lingered in the living room. As I washed the dishes, I caught my reflection in the window. My hair pulled back in a tight knot, my hands red from the water, my eyes tired. Afterward, I walked out to the backyard, letting the evening air cool my face. Fireflies drifted over the grass, blinking on and off in the shadows. I listened to the distant hum of traffic, the murmur of television through the open kitchen window. For a moment, I closed my eyes and remembered a summer years ago, Frank laughing beside me, Hope chasing moths through the dusk, the sweet smell of honeysuckle drifting from the fence line. I opened my eyes and walked back inside the ache in my chest, both familiar and new. Upstairs, I paused outside Hope's door. I heard her on the phone with a friend, her laughter bright, her words spilling out in a way I hadn't heard in months. I knocked gently. "Hope, it's Grandma. I just wanted to say goodnight." She answered with a quiet night barely audible through the wood. I stood there a moment, hand on the doorknob, and then let go. In the quiet of my own room, I sat on the bed, folding and refolding a handkerchief. I thought about the years I'd spent making sure everyone else felt safe, cared for, seen. I thought about the small kindnesses that had once filled my days. Notes tucked in lunchboxes, cookies baked for the neighbors, the gentle touch of Frank's hand on mine. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the creak of the house, and let the memories roll through me. A little later, I took out the small box where I kept letters from my sister, old cards from Michael, faded Polaroids of Hope as a baby. I sorted through them one by one, the paper worn soft from years of handling. Near the bottom, I found a letter from Diana. I'd never answered her neat handwriting, asking how I was settling in and if I needed anything. I held it in my lap for a long time, the words blurring as dusk gave way to night. As the clock ticked past midnight, I set the letter aside and stood by the window, watching the neighborhood lights wink out one by one. I saw my own reflection, older, maybe lonelier, but still here. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel the weight of everything I'd lost and everything I might still have left. When I finally slipped into bed, I turned out the light and stared into the darkness, listening to the soft whir of the fan overhead. Somewhere in the stillness, a quiet thought rose up, an understanding that the ache inside me wasn't just loneliness, but something closer to longing, a reminder that I was still here, still wanting to be seen, still holding on to hope. Morning would come soon enough. I didn't know what might change, but I knew now that I wanted something more. And that gentle realization, soft as the light before dawn, stayed with me through the night and into the day that followed. The morning air was heavy with the promise of rain. I stood by the kitchen sink, staring out at the pale gray sky as the coffee pot sputtered behind me. The house was quiet, save for the steady tick of the clock and the distant hum of Leslie's hairdryer in the upstairs bathroom. I poured myself a cup and leaned against the counter, breathing in the scent of dark roast, letting my mind wander through the quiet hours of the night before. Something had shifted in me. I moved through the house with a new kind of purpose, pausing in each room, letting my hand rest on the back of a chair or the cool edge of the mantel. I straightened picture frames, opened curtains, let light into spaces Leslie always preferred to keep dim. For the first time in months, I found myself humming softly as I tidied up the melody trailing behind me like a thread. Later that morning, I slipped on my coat and walked down to the corner pharmacy, tucking my house key deep in my pocket. The air outside felt sharp and clean, the sidewalk still wet from the night's rain. As I walked, I noticed the forsythia blooming along the fence line, the first splash of yellow against the brown of late winter. I thought about calling my sister, about hearing a voice that remembered me from before all of this. The idea stayed with me as I picked up my prescription, smiled at the clerk, and made my way back home. Back at the house, I found Hope at the kitchen table, her books spread out in front of her. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes searching mine for a moment before flicking away. "Do you need help with your math?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She shook her head. "It's just a worksheet." I poured another cup of coffee and sat across from her, listening to the scratch of her pencil, the rain beginning to tap softly at the window. The doorbell rang a little after noon. I went to answer it, surprised to find Marlene from the garden club standing on the porch with a box of homemade cookies and a smile. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, pressing the box into my hands. "Thought you might like a treat." I welcomed her inside, and we sat in the living room talking about old neighbors and the upcoming plant sale at the church. It was the first real conversation I'd had in weeks, and I felt something in me loosen as we laughed about the tulips that never came up last year. Leslie came home just as Marlene was leaving her keys jangling in her hand. She stopped short when she saw us, her smile a little too bright. "Well, isn't this nice?" she said, glancing at the cookie box. "We just don't have the space for gatherings right now, do we?" "Evelyn?" Marlene patted my arm and said goodbye, promising to call soon. I watched her walk down the driveway, her coat buttoned against the wind, and felt a flicker of something like courage rise up inside me. That evening, after dinner, I sat at the kitchen table and sorted through the mail. Most of it was junk, but tucked between a bank statement and an ad for gutter cleaning was a letter addressed to me in careful, unfamiliar handwriting. I opened it slowly, unfolding the paper. It was from a woman named Susan, someone I'd known long ago at church, writing to say she'd heard I was living nearby and would love to catch up if I ever had time. I set the letter aside, thinking about the web of people who still remembered me, the threads that connected my life to something bigger than this house. After everyone had gone to bed, I found myself in the hallway, looking at the row of family photos. I reached out and straightened the frame with Michael and Hope at the lake, my fingers tracing their smiles. The house was still. I walked back to my room, pulled out my old address book, and flipped through the pages. So many names, so many years. I circled 3 numbers, my sister Diana, Marlene, and now Susan, then set the book on my nightstand. The next morning, I woke early and sat by the window, watching the sun climb through the branches of the old maple in the yard. Hope was already up packing her backpack for school. I watched her move through the kitchen, the way she paused to pour a glass of orange juice, the way her hair fell across her cheek. "Have a good day, sweetheart," I said, reaching for her hand. She let me squeeze her fingers just for a second before slipping out the door. Leslie came downstairs a few minutes later, her arms full of dry cleaning. "Don't forget, Evelyn, I need you to sign these papers for the bank," she said, handing me a pen and a stack of forms. I glanced at the top sheet, my heart beating a little faster. "Power of attorney," it read in bold black letters. I looked up, catching her eye. "Why do I need to sign this?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Leslie smiled, her tone too smooth. "It's just for the insurance, nothing serious. Michael said you'd take care of it." I set the pen down and pushed the papers back across the table. "I'd like to read them first." Leslie's smile faltered, but she didn't push. "Suit yourself," she said, gathering her things and heading for the door. I watched her go, the weight of my decision settling over me. Later that day, I called Diana. Her voice on the other end of the line was warm and familiar, the years between us falling away with each word. We talked about childhood, about the old house, about Frank, and how much the world had changed. "You're not alone, Evelyn," she said, her words a balm against the loneliness. "Call me anytime." That afternoon, I sat in the living room and watched the rain fall against the windows, my hands resting in my lap. Hope joined me for a while, her homework forgotten, her questions simple and gentle. "Grandma, did you ever feel scared to try something new?" I smiled and told her stories of moving to Cherry Lane, of learning to drive, of starting over after Frank passed. She listened, her eyes wide, and when she hugged me goodnight, I held on a little longer than usual. Before I went to bed, I placed the stack of unsigned papers on Michael's desk, a note on top in my careful handwriting. "I'd like to talk about these before I sign." I stood for a moment in the doorway, watching the soft light of his desk lamp, and felt a small sense of rightness settle in my chest. As I turned out the light and climbed into bed, I realized something had changed. I was no longer content to fade quietly into the background. The world outside the windows was waiting for me, bright with possibility. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, I was ready to meet it. And as the house slipped into silence, I knew there were still steps I could take and strength left in me I hadn't yet used. That night, I woke before dawn, my mind turning over everything that had happened. The house was still, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the hall clock. I slipped my feet into my slippers and wandered through the rooms, pausing at the dining table where the unsigned papers still sat. In the dim morning light, they looked less threatening, just ink and paper. But I remembered the pressure in Leslie's voice, the way she'd smiled too tightly, the way Michael had looked away when I asked questions. I poured myself a glass of water and watched the shadows move across the tile, the old ache of uncertainty settling in my chest. After breakfast, I took my address book from the drawer and dialed Marlene's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and full of life. We chatted about the upcoming plant sale, about the azaleas she'd coaxed into bloom then, without quite knowing how I found myself explaining what was going on. "Marlene," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I think something's wrong here." "They want me to sign a papers I don't understand. I don't feel like myself anymore." She listened, not interrupting, and then she said, "You're not alone, Evelyn. If you need help, I'll be here. And if you need a witness or someone to sit with you while you talk to the bank, just say the word." I felt a wave of relief, a small spark of hope. I spent the morning gathering documents, old bank statements, pension letters, anything that proved my history and my intentions. I set them in a neat pile on my nightstand, feeling stronger with each paper I stacked. When Leslie came downstairs, she barely looked my way, just muttered that she'd be back late, and swept out the door with a rustle of her coat. I watched her go, the silence settling around me again. After lunch, I took a walk to clear my head. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of spring. As I turned the corner by the library, I saw Diana's car parked outside her window rolled down. She waved me over, her face open and kind. "I thought I'd stop by and check on you," she said. We sat together in her car for a long time, the heater humming, talking about everything and nothing, old recipes. Our mother's laugh. How quiet the world felt after loss. Eventually, I told her about the bank papers, about Leslie's insistence, about how small I'd started to feel. "You don't have to sign anything," Diana said quietly. "Not if you're not comfortable, and you don't have to let anyone make you feel less than who you are." When I got home, Hope was waiting at the table with a plate of cookies. "Grandma, do you want to play a game?" she asked, her voice uncertain. We set up a puzzle on the living room floor, working side by side. She was quiet for a while, then glanced up and asked, "Are you okay?" I looked at her, my granddaughter, her hair falling over her cheek, her hands steady on the puzzle pieces. "I'm all right," I said, and for the first time, I almost believed it. Later that afternoon, Michael came home early. He set his briefcase down and looked at me across the kitchen. "Leslie said you didn't sign the papers," he said, his voice careful. I nodded, my hands resting in my lap. "I want to know what they're for," I replied. "I want to understand everything before I put my name to it." He hesitated, then pulled out a chair and sat beside me. "It's just routine, Mom. The bank needs it for the insurance. Leslie's been handling most of it." I shook my head. "I want to handle my own affairs. I want to read everything, and I want to talk to someone at the bank myself." Michael's shoulders slumped, but he didn't argue. "All right," he said. "We can do that." That night, I called Susan, the friend who'd written to me. Her voice was bright, her laughter easy. She told me stories about her grandchildren, about the book club she'd joined, about how she still missed her late husband every time she heard their favorite song. We talked long after the sun went down, the comfort of old friendship wrapping around me like a shawl. The next morning, the rain came down in sheets. Leslie found me at the kitchen table, my hands folded over a list of questions I'd written for the bank. She frowned, but I met her gaze. "I'll go to the bank with Michael. I want to hear everything for myself," I said. She opened her mouth to argue, then thought better of it, her eyes hard. "Suit yourself," she said, turning away. I watched her retreat, feeling something old and heavy loosen in my chest. Later, as I gathered my coat and purse, Hope came into the hallway. "Grandma, can I come with you?" she asked. I smiled and nodded. We drove together, Hope quietly humming along to the radio, the sky clearing above us as the storm moved on. At the bank, I sat across from the manager, Michael, beside me. I read every page, asked every question, insisted on taking copies home. When I found something I didn't understand, I asked again, unwilling to be hurried or pushed. That afternoon, I met Marlene for coffee at the little diner on Main Street. She listened as I described the meeting, her eyes kind. "You did the right thing," she said, patting my hand. "You stood up for yourself. That matters." I watched people coming and going on the sidewalk, their coats buttoned tight against the wind, and felt a new steadiness in my bones. Back at the house, the sun was setting, the windows glowing with golden light. Leslie avoided my eyes at dinner, her words clipped and cold. Michael was quiet, Hope unusually gentle. After the table was cleared, I sat in my room, the stack of documents in front of me. I realized that for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of what came next. As I got ready for bed, I glanced at the photo of Frank and me on the dresser, his smile as familiar as the sound of my own name. I pressed my hand to the glass, remembering the way he used to tell me, "Don't let anyone push you around, Evie. You know your worth." I drew the curtains closed and slipped beneath the quilt, feeling the warmth of all those who still loved me, my friends, my family, even those who were gone. I closed my eyes, letting the steady hush of the house lull me to sleep, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, I was no longer standing alone. And as I drifted off, I felt something new, a sense of peace and the quiet, growing certainty that I was ready for the fight ahead. The morning came soft and bright sunlight slipping in beneath the curtains, painting thin golden stripes across the end of my bed. I lay still for a long moment, listening to the creaks of the house, the distant sound of birds, the faintest echo of Hope's laughter drifting up from the kitchen. There was a new steadiness in my chest, the kind that comes after a long night spent deciding you'll no longer let fear make the rules. By 9 o'clock, I'd dressed in a navy sweater and slacks, fixed my hair the way Frank always liked, and brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to cut through anything. I took my time at the kitchen table reading over the documents I'd brought from the bank. I traced the lines of my own signature, studied the small print, the careful wording. I called Marlene, my voice clear. "Would you come over this morning? I might need someone to stand with me." She didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Just before Marlene arrived, Michael stepped into the kitchen. He was already dressed for work, tie, perfectly knotted jacket thrown over one arm. "Mom, I saw your note. You're really not going to sign." There was no anger in his voice, only something tired and quiet. I set down my mug. "No, Michael, not until I understand every part of it. And not without my own lawyer." He nodded, his shoulders slumping, as if he'd expected this, but hadn't wanted to face it. "I didn't want it to go this way," he said softly, but he left the room before I could answer. Marlene came in just as Leslie swept downstairs, her purse tucked under her arm, her expression hard. "What's this? Evelyn?" Leslie asked, waving a letter from the lawyer's office I'd contacted the night before. "You've involved attorneys now?" I looked at her, keeping my voice steady. "I have a right to protect myself and my home." Marlene moved quietly to my side, a silent pillar. Leslie's mouth tightened, but she didn't argue. We spent the morning waiting for a call from the lawyer's office. The hours passed slowly, every minute heavy with the knowledge that things could never go back to how they were. Around noon, the phone rang. I answered, holding the receiver steady, listening as the lawyer explained the next steps. The importance of preserving every document, every message, every memory of what had happened in the house. "If anyone pressures you," he said, "call me immediately. You're not alone in this." That afternoon, I gathered everything: bank statements, letters, even the list of missing keepsakes, into a folder. I walked them down to the law office on Main Street, Marlene at my side. The receptionist greeted us kindly, and I sat across from the attorney as he reviewed each page, his brow furrowing in quiet concern. "You did the right thing, Mrs. Harper," he said. "You were wise to bring all this." When I came home, Hope met me at the door, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "How did it go, Grandma?" she asked. I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "We're making sure things are safe now, honey, for both of us." She nodded, her eyes older than her years. Later that evening, as rain streaked the windows, Leslie and Michael sat together in the living room, their voices low and tense. I could hear my name, could hear the word lawyer, the quick, nervous edge to Leslie's words. I stayed in the kitchen with Hope, her homework spread between us, the familiar comfort of multiplication tables grounding me as the storm rolled on outside. After dinner, Michael came to find me. He paused in the doorway, hands in his pockets, uncertainty written across his face. "Mom, I want you to know I never wanted you to feel this way. I know I haven't been as present as I should have been." I listened, letting him find his words. It got away from me, all of it. Leslie's been under pressure with work and the house, and I thought, if I just went along, things would settle down. I didn't realize how much you were hurting. He met my eyes, then for the first time in weeks. "I'm sorry, Mom. I really am." I nodded, not trusting my voice, but reached for his hand. It was enough for now. Later, Marlene called to check in. "You did it, Evelyn," she said gently. "You put your foot down, and the world didn't end." We laughed, a soft, tired sound, but it was the first real laughter I'd heard in that house in a long time. That night, I tidied up my room, laying out a fresh blouse for the meeting with the lawyer tomorrow. I glanced at the photo of Frank and me on the nightstand, the edges curled from years of sunlight. You'd be proud, I whispered, then turned out the light. I drifted to sleep, knowing the most difficult conversation still lay ahead, but the ground beneath my feet was steadier than it had been in a long time. For the first time, I felt sure that whatever happened next, I was no longer standing alone in the dark. And as the house grew quiet around me, I listened to the soft breath of my granddaughter, asleep in the next room, and knew there were still new beginnings left, even after all these years. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new kind of quiet, gentler, steadier, with less fear. I spent my mornings on the back porch, watching the light move across the yard. Hope's laughter sometimes echoing through the open kitchen window. The legal business moved forward as it should, every document reviewed carefully, every step taken with my lawyer by my side. Leslie moved out by the end of that first month. Michael stayed helping with the repairs and the gardening, but something in him had changed. He listened now, and when he spoke, it was softer, more honest, as if he was learning how to begin again. Marlene came by every Thursday with a basket of blueberry muffins, just as she had when Frank was alive. We'd sit together in the living room, talking about old times, trading stories, and quiet jokes, a kind of friendship I'd nearly forgotten I needed. Sometimes I'd catch Hope peeking in a shy smile on her face, and I'd ask her to join us. She always did. Her presence was a gentle reminder that life doesn't stop giving you family, even when some ties are broken. As the days warmed and spring faded into summer, I found myself feeling lighter. I opened the windows, let the breeze wander through the house, and unpacked old boxes I'd hidden away for years. Each photograph, every letter felt like a piece of myself coming home. When the final legal papers arrived, confirming the house and my accounts were truly my own, I sat down at the dining table and allowed myself a long, quiet moment to breathe it all in. One evening, Michael sat beside me as the sun set, his voice low. "Mom, I know I can't undo what's happened. I just hope you'll let me try to make things right." I put my hand over his and nodded. "We're both learning," I told him, "and we both still have time." It was enough. Not a perfect ending, but a real one, honest and human. What I've learned is this: there's no age limit on starting over. Dignity isn't something others can take away from you, not if you hold on to your own sense of worth. Justice, when it comes, might look quieter than you imagine. Sometimes it's a letter in the mail, a voice on the phone, the warmth of a granddaughter's hug. Sometimes it's just the courage to say, "No more," and to mean it. The world can change, even late in the day, when you decide you deserve better. If you're listening tonight and you see a piece of your own story in mine, I hope you'll remember you're never too old or too tired to claim your place, to reach out for help, or to stand tall in the face of injustice. And if you know someone who needs to hear these words, I hope you'll share this with them. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. Don't forget to let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you know where to find me. Take care, and remember your story matters.